You could lose everything in Nauru if Australia cuts funding tomorrow. Hospitals would close. Schools would shut down. Government would collapse. And Nauru isn't alone. 10 countries depend on Australia so completely. They'd face economic catastrophe within months without it. But here's the part that'll shock you. This dependency isn't accidental. It's designed. And the consequences are darker than anyone admits publicly. But wait. Before we begin, please subscribe to ensure that you never miss out on any of my essential stuff. Comment "I subscribe" below, and I will personally welcome you to our community. With that said, let's get started. 1. Nauru. Let's start with the most extreme case, Nauru. This island nation is smaller than most international airports. Population, 12,500 people. That's a small town. But here's what most people don't know. 95% of Nauru's government budget comes from Australia. That's not a typo. 95%. Meet David Chen, an Australian aid worker who was stationed in Nauru in 2023. He witnessed a crisis that still haunts him. Australian funding got delayed, bureaucratic red tape, nothing sinister. But those delays meant Dallas's machines sat broken for 3 months. Patients with treatable kidney disease died waiting. David told me he felt helpless, watching preventable deaths happen because the money didn't arrive on time. According to the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs 2024 report, Australia provides $27 million annually to Nauru. Without it, the country has no economy, no tax base, no industry. But before you think this is pure charity, here's the twist. Australia gets something big in return. Nauru hosts Australian offshore detention centers, controversial facilities for asylum seekers. Those contracts, worth over $400 million. So who's really dependent on whom? But Nauru isn't even close to the most desperate situation. That's when things took a darker turn. 2. Tuvalu. Imagine your entire country slowly drowning. Not metaphorically. Literally sinking into the ocean while the world watches. That's Tuvalu right now. In 2024, I spoke with Government Minister Turquoise, who had just returned from Canberra. He'd been begging Australian officials for expanded climate refugee status. His voice cracked when he talked about his daughter's school. At high tide, seawater floods the classrooms. He's already planning which families evacuate first when the islands become uninhabitable. Can you imagine having to make that choice? Here's what makes this devastating. Australia signed a historic climate migration deal in November 2023, accepting 280 Tuvaluans per year for permanent resettlement. It sounds generous until you realize Tuvalu's population is 11,000, and sea levels are rising 5 millimeters every single year. The data is brutal. 75% of Tuvalu's infrastructure projects are funded by Australian aid, $11 million in 2024 alone. Roads, hospitals, water systems, all Australian money. But here's the betrayal that Minister Turquoise mentioned. Australia is one of the world's largest coal exporters. They are profiting from a very fossil fuels that are drowning Tuvalu while positioning themselves as the saviors with migration deals. The new climate mobility visa does offer Tuvaluans the chance to work, study, and resettle in Australia before total submersion, predicted by 2050. But critics call it managed extinction with good PR. Wait until you hear about the colonial legacy that never ended. 3. Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea got independence from Australia in 1975. But did the dependency ever actually end? Not even close. Sarah Martinez, a mining consultant from Perth, spent 2023 and 2024 working in Port Moresby. What she saw disturbed her. Entire hospitals run by Australian doctors. Schools taught almost entirely by Australian teachers. Police forces trained by Australian officers. When she asked locals about it, one government official told her bluntly, "We got independence on paper, but Australia still holds the wallet. We can't make major decisions without checking if the funding will continue." Let me hit you with the numbers. Australia gives PNG $654 million in aid for 2024 to 25. That's the largest aid recipient in the entire world for Australia. But it's not just aid, it's economic control. Trade between the two countries is worth $8.2 billion, mostly resource extraction that heavily favors Australian mining companies. And here's the brain drain. 89% of PNG's university graduates leave to work in Australia. Think about that. The country invests in educating its best minds, and Australia harvests the talent. Sarah told me about the new bilateral security treaty signed in 2023. On paper, it looks good. Australia helps with infrastructure, PNG gets development. But read the fine print. Australia gets military access to PNG bases, control over who else PNG partners with, and effective veto power over Chinese investment. Critics aren't wrong when they call it neo-colonialism with better PR. The uncomfortable truth: PNG can't afford to say no, and Australia knows it. But here's where it gets interesting: the country that tried to escape. 4. Kiribati. Kiribati did something bold in 2019. They cut diplomatic ties with Taiwan, Australia's ally, and partnered with China instead. Beijing promised $66 million in infrastructure investments. Kiribati thought they'd found a way out of Australian dependence. It backfired spectacularly. Australian Ambassador James Riley watched the whole thing unfold. By 2024, China's promises had mostly failed. Projects stalled. Debt mounted. The infrastructure didn't materialize. And then, quietly, Kiribati approached Australia for a bailout. Riley told me he felt vindicated but also disturbed, watching desperate countries being used as chess pieces in geopolitical games between superpowers. Australia welcomed them back, with conditions. Kiribati now receives $94 million in Australian aid annually. That's 67% of their entire GDP coming from foreign aid. Think about that dependency level. And the climate crisis makes it worse. By 2070, up to 50% of Kiribati's land could be underwater. But Australia's strategy here is clear: outspend China to maintain Pacific influence. The new defense agreement signed in late 2024 allows Australian patrol boats to guard Kiribati's waters against illegal Chinese fishing. Sounds helpful, right? Except it also means Kiribati can't partner with China for maritime security even if they wanted to. Australia learned the lesson. Once you have a country dependent, you don't let them explore alternatives. You increase the dependency. Wait, it gets worse when you hear about the medical control. 5. Timor-Leste. 4,000 medical emergencies every single year. That's how many people Timor-Leste sends to Australia for treatment because they can't handle the cases themselves. Without Australia's medical system, those patients simply die. Dr. Anna Santos is a Timorese surgeon who trained in Darwin. She told me about a case that broke her heart: a 7-year-old girl with treatable leukemia. Timor-Leste has no oncology unit. None. So the girl was airlifted to Brisbane. Her mother sold the family's land to afford it. Australian aid covered 80% of the cost, which sounds generous until you realize why Timor-Leste doesn't have its own cancer treatment facilities. Dr. Anna's words haunted me. We are dependent because we were never allowed to build our own capacity. During Indonesian occupation, education was suppressed. After independence in 2002, Australia provided aid, but mostly through Australian contractors and flying experts. We are grateful, but we are trapped. The 2024 Australian aid to Timor-Leste is $128 million. The Australian-funded National Hospital in Dili treats 85% of critical cases. But here's the controversy nobody talks about. There's an ongoing dispute over oil and gas revenue in the shared maritime zone between Australia and Timor-Leste. That revenue is worth an estimated $40 billion over 50 years. Timor argues Australia drew maritime boundaries unfairly during negotiations when Timor was a newborn nation with zero leverage. There's a new medical training program sending Australian doctors to teach in Timor, building local expertise instead of dependency. But it'll take 15 years to see results. In the meantime, every cancer patient, every cardiac emergency, every complex surgery, they all get shipped to Australia. This is the part that shocked me most, because the next country isn't even in the Pacific. 6. Bangladesh. Your cheap t-shirt probably came from Bangladesh. And Bangladesh's garment industry depends heavily on Australian cotton. The connection most people never see. Rashid Ahmed owns a garment factory in Dhaka employing 3,000 workers. They make clothes for Australian brands you'd recognize. In 2023, Australian cotton exports dropped 15% due to massive floods. Rashid's factory nearly closed. Workers' families face potential starvation. He told me he realized his entire supply chain, his workers' livelihoods, everything. It all hangs on Australian weather patterns and export decisions. Here are the numbers. Australia exports $650 million worth of cotton to Bangladesh annually as of 2024. That cotton feeds an industry employing 4.2 million Bangladeshi garment workers. Bangladesh is Australia's fourth largest cotton export market. The dependency is massive. Now, Bangladesh is trying to diversify, bringing in cotton from India and the USA. But Australian cotton has a 30% cost advantage due to quality and logistics. Bangladeshi factories are economically locked in. They can't easily switch suppliers without massive cost increases that would make them uncompetitive globally. And here's the thing. When Australia's cotton industry sneezes, whether from drought, flood, or trade policy changes, millions of Bangladeshi workers feel it immediately. Now, here's what nobody tells you about the infrastructure trap. 7. Solomon Islands. Australia just spent $202 million on infrastructure in Solomon Islands. Roads, bridges, ports. Sounds great, right? But here's the catch that locals discovered too late. Miriam Kalo is a local activist who protested when she found out the details. Those Australian-built roads, they require Australian contractors for maintenance. Permanent contracts worth millions. A community wanted to hire local workers who desperately need jobs. The Solomon Islands government told them, accept Australian terms or lose all future funding. Miriam's words stuck with me. This feels like economic colonization. We are grateful for the roads, but we are locked into dependency for decades. The 2024 Australian aid to Solomon Islands is $202 million, given after the country briefly flirted with Chinese partnership. That flotation scared Australia enough to increase aid by 35%. But the new security pact signed in 2023 effectively blocks Chinese investment. And here's the consequence. Solomon Islands' GDP growth dropped from 4.2% to 1.8% as Chinese infrastructure projects were halted mid-construction. Australia's defense. Only their contractors meet safety standards for long-term maintenance. Critics respond, that's convenient when you want to ensure permanent economic dependence. The infrastructure projects employ 78% Australian contractors. Money flowing in circles back to Australian companies while locals watch from the sidelines. That's when the local police showed up in our next story. 8. Vanuatu. When Cyclone Lola smashed into Vanuatu in October 2023, guess who responded? Australia. Within 48 hours, the Australian Defence Force arrived with $65 million in disaster relief. Marcus Webb, an Australian pilot, flew those aid missions. He saw Port VR devastated. No power, no water, hospitals destroyed. He felt proud helping. But a local NGO worker told him something that changed his perspective. We are incredibly grateful you're here. But we can't even respond to our own disasters anymore. We are completely dependent on foreign military for survival. The data backs this up. Vanuatu faces 2 to 3 major cyclones every single year. Australian disaster relief and total aid in 2023 to 24, $178 million. And here's the concerning part. 91% of Vanuatu's emergency response infrastructure is Australian-owned or operated. They've lost the capacity to save themselves. The Climate Vulnerability Index ranks Vanuatu as the #1 most at-risk nation globally. Rising seas, increasing cyclone intensity, food insecurity, it's all getting worse. Australia is training Vanuatu's own emergency response teams, which is positive. But the climate crisis is accelerating faster than capacity building can happen. So Vanuatu faces a choice that's not really a choice. Accept permanent Australian presence in their disaster response, or face catastrophe alone. Wait until you hear what happened to their sovereignty in the next country. 9. Samoa. Samoa has a pipeline problem. Not for oil, for brains. Their best and brightest all flow in one direction, to Australia. And it's not an accident. It's designed into the aid system. Meet Tali Umenu, top graduate from Samoa's National University in 2023. Brilliant student. received an Australian scholarship for medical school in Melbourne. She was thrilled. It's an incredible opportunity. But on the day she left, her village elders gathered. One told her bluntly, "You'll never come back." She tried to promise she would, but she couldn't say it with conviction. Here's why. Samoa has 0.8 doctors per 1,000 people. Australia has 4.1 doctors per 1,000. The salary difference? A doctor in Samoa makes $18,000 per year. In Australia, $150,000 minimum. Taliu would have to choose between serving her community and financial survival. Australia provides 3,700 scholarships annually to Pacific students. 840 of those go to Samoans. Sounds generous until you see the retention rate. 87% don't return home after graduation. The talent drain is systematic. Samoa's GDP is $844 million. Remittances from Australia-based Samoans send back $210 million. That's 25% of GDP. It's a circular trap. Aid funds education. Education exports workers. Workers send money home. Home stays dependent on aid. There are new return incentive programs offering Australian-level salaries to work in home countries. But only 11% of graduates participate. Why go back to struggling infrastructure when you can build a life in Australia? Samoa invests in talent. Australia harvests it, and everyone calls it development assistance. The real cost? Nobody saw it coming in our final country. 10. Fiji. Fiji is the crown jewel of Pacific tourism. White sand beaches, crystal water, luxury resorts. But here's what tourists don't see. Australia controls Fiji's economy more than Fiji does. Anjali Prasad manages a resort in Nadi. After COVID restrictions lifted in 2023 to 24, Australian tourists flooded back, 400,000 annually, making up 35% of all Fiji's tourists. That's great for business, right? Except Australian airlines control the flight routes. Australian hotel chains own the major resorts. When Anjali tried raising wages for her local staff, they make an average of $8,400 per year, while Australian resort profits hit $340 million annually. Australian management threatened, "We'll relocate to Vanuatu." She realized Fiji doesn't control its own tourism industry despite tourism being 38% of their GDP. But it goes deeper. Australian aid to Fiji for 2024 to 25, $97 million. Australian military training program, $44 million since 2018. Australia trains Fiji's police and defense forces. Trade relationship, $1.1 billion, heavily favoring Australia. When Fiji's government tried exploring Chinese tourism markets, which were growing 38% year-on-year pre-COVID, Australia applied pressure through aid conditions. Anjali described it perfectly. "We are economically colonized, but we smile for the tourist because we have no other choice." The new geopolitical reality in the Pacific is clear. Australia and China are competing for influence, and small island nations are the battleground. Australia's strategy is to make these countries so economically dependent that choosing China becomes impossible. It's working. But at what cost to these nations' sovereignty and self-determination? So here's my question for you. Is Australia helping these 10 countries develop, or systematically keeping them dependent? Should any country be allowed to use aid as geopolitical control, or is this just how international relations work in the 21st century? There's no easy answer. Australia provides genuine help, disaster relief, medical care, education, infrastructure. Without it, millions would suffer. But that dependency also strips sovereignty, controls economic choices, and perpetuates neo-colonial relationships under the banner of partnership. I want to hear your take in the comments. And if you're from any of these 10 countries, Nauru, Tuvalu, PNG, Kiribati, Timor-Leste, Bangladesh, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Samoa, or Fiji, tell us what life is really like. Your government can't speak freely because aid depends on it. But you can. Share your story below. The world needs to hear it.